Commander Grant Holloway pointed straight at her face and said, "Lost sweetheart." And the whole room laughed. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a problem she already knows how to fix. What Holloway didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman sitting quietly at that table had already saved every single one of their lives. They just hadn't found out yet. If this story hits you the way it hit us, drop your city in the comments right now. We want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with us all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. The morning of Operation Silent Lantern began the way most classified missions begin, with bad coffee, fluorescent lights that buzzed a little too loudly, and men who had spent their entire careers learning to trust each other and almost no one else. Commander Grant Holloway arrived at the secure operations room at 5:38 in the morning, 2 minutes early. He was always 2 minutes early. It was one of those small, unspoken habits that told the men around him everything they needed to know about how he moved through the world. Purposeful, controlled, never off balance. He set his coffee down on the corner of the tactical table, rolled up his sleeves the way he always did before a final mission briefing, and let his eyes sweep the room. His SEALs were already there. 8 of them filling the chairs closest to the primary display screen, their body language, that particular combination of relaxed and ready that only comes from years of working together. These were not nervous men. These were men who had walked into places most human beings never knew existed, done things most human beings would never understand, and come home to do it again. Holloway knew each of them the way a conductor knows his orchestra. Master Chief Aaron Beckett sat closest to the door as he always did, one arm resting on the back of the empty chair beside him, his eyes already scanning the operational display like he was reading a map he had memorized 20 times already. Beckett was 47 years old and had been in special operations long enough to remember when half the equipment in this room didn't exist. He had more operational experience than almost anyone in the building, and he wore it the way old soldiers wear old scars, quietly without decoration. Lieutenant Commander Trevor Kane stood near the communication station, reviewing a set of satellite imagery printouts with the focused, slightly distracted energy of a man who had been awake since 3 in the morning. Kane was Task Force's operations officer, the person responsible for making sure every intelligence thread, every communication channel, every coordination requirement between participating units was woven tightly together before the mission clock started. He was good at his job. Everyone said so. The room smelled like coffee and tension, and the particular kind of institutional cleanliness that comes from a facility that never fully sleeps. Holloway was beginning his second review of the mission slides when the door opened. He didn't look up immediately. New people walked in and out of briefings all the time. Analysts, coordinators, technical specialists with badge access and short-time windows who dropped information and disappeared. Then something made him look. Maybe it was the quiet, the way her footsteps didn't announce themselves. She wore a plain dark field jacket over her uniform. No medals, no visible rank insignia on display. She carried a secure tablet in one hand and a sealed folder in the other, and she walked directly to the empty chair beside the primary tactical display. The chair that in every briefing Holloway had ever run was reserved for the mission commander. She sat down like she owned it. Holloway stared. Around the room, his operators exchanged looks, quick looks, the kind that pass between men who have spent enough time together to communicate entire conversations with a single glance. One of the younger operators near the back, Petty Officer First Class, Danny Reyes, 29 years old and still young enough to think certain things were funny, pressed his lips together to keep from smiling. Holloway set down his coffee. He crossed the room. She was already opening the tablet, scrolling through something, and she didn't look up when he stopped beside her chair. That was the thing that surprised him first. Not just that she hadn't acknowledged him, but that she seemed completely unbothered by the fact that she hadn't acknowledged him. Lost sweetheart. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples moved exactly the way Holloway expected them to. Several men laughed. Not loud, not cruel exactly. The kind of laughter that happens when the person who runs the room makes a joke and everyone in the room knows the safest thing to do is find it funny. Then she looked up. She had calm eyes, the kind that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. She looked at Holloway the way someone looks at a door they've opened 100 times without ceremony, without aggression. Just steady assessment. No commander. Her voice was even. No defensive edge. No performance of patience. Just a flat, factual correction delivered like a weather report. Holloway felt a flicker of something he didn't immediately identify. Irritation, mostly. But beneath it, something smaller, a faint uncertainty there and gone before he named it. He pointed toward the door. This briefing isn't for visitors. She held his gaze. Good, she said. I'm not visiting. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. All at once. Like someone had reached across the room and turned a dial. Beckett, who had seen Holloway run 1,000 rooms, watched this exchange with the particular kind of careful stillness that he reserved for situations he hadn't fully categorized yet. His eyes moved between Holloway and the woman in the chair, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fraction of increased attention. Holloway stood very still. In nearly 20 years of special operations, he had learned to read rooms the way other men read books. He knew when a space shifted. He knew when something was off. And something was very much off right now, not in a tactical sense, but in the quieter, more uncomfortable sense of a man who had made a confident move and suddenly wasn't certain the board was arranged the way he thought it was. But he was Commander Grant Holloway. He had operated in 8 countries. He had received a Silver Star, and he had buried friends and continued the mission and led his men home more times than he allowed himself to count. He did not get rattled by a stranger in a chair. He turned back to the tactical display. We'll sort this out after the brief, he said, as if granting a concession, as if he were the one being reasonable here. She opened her tablet and said nothing. Holloway began. Operation Silent Lantern had been 18 days in the planning. 5 American humanitarian workers had been taken from a medical supply convoy in a remote region and moved through a series of transfers that ground intelligence had tracked with considerable difficulty to an abandoned industrial complex in an isolated stretch of desert. The compound sat within a natural depression surrounded by elevated terrain on 3 sides, which meant ground approaches were limited and air approaches were visible from a significant distance. The mission architecture Holloway had built was elegant. 2 SEAL elements would approach from the east through a dry riverbed using the natural channel to mask their movement. A surveillance aircraft would maintain continuous overhead watch-feeding real-time imagery to the command center. Electronic warfare assets would generate a disruption window, a carefully timed interference burst that would blind hostile communications for a narrow period. During that window, the assault teams would move. The helicopters would enter the extraction zone. 8 minutes in and out before the enemy could coordinate a response. Holloway talked through it the way he always talked through missions, with a quiet, methodical authority that came from knowing every element of the plan well enough to defend any piece of it on a moment's notice. He didn't use unnecessary words. He didn't oversell. He stated what would happen and what would follow, and the men around him tracked it with the focused absorption of professionals who had heard many briefings, but treated this one as if it were the first. The woman at the table listened too, but she listened differently. She was looking at the tactical display, but her eyes weren't moving the way everyone else's did. They weren't following Holloway's pointer from element to element, building the picture as he presented it. They were already somewhere else on the screen, already sitting with a piece of the information that nobody else in the room was looking at yet. Holloway reached the final slide, the extraction window, 8 minutes marked on the timeline in clear green blocks. Questions, he said. The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Your extraction window is wrong. Holloway turned. The room turned with him. She was still looking at the tactical display. Not at him, at the screen. Excuse me, Holloway said. His voice was careful, level. The voice of a man working very hard to remain measured. Your helicopters won't have 8 minutes, she said. Holloway felt the irritation sharpen into something more specific, more personal. According to who? According to the weather system moving across the western ridge. The dismissal was already forming on his lips. They had already checked the forecast. The meteorological window was within acceptable parameters. He had run this calculation 3 times with the aviation element, but something about the way she said it stopped him just briefly enough. We already checked the forecast, he said. I know, she said. I wasn't talking about weather. She reached forward and tapped a sequence on her tablet. On the primary display, a new overlay appeared. A pattern of interference bands crossing the sector to the west of the extraction zone, faint irregular, layered in a way that looked almost like atmospheric noise if you weren't looking carefully. This interference pattern, she said, standing now moving to the screen with the unhurried confidence of someone explaining something to people she expects to understand, it has been consistent for the last 6 hours. It's not natural. Natural atmospheric interference doesn't hold position. This is moving with the wind pattern rather than ahead of it. It's being generated. Beckett straightened in his chair. Generated, Holloway repeated. His voice was flat. Deliberately, she said. Someone is layering electronic noise in the extraction corridor. Not enough to jam the helicopters entirely. Enough to degrade the navigation systems during approach. Enough to extend the ingress time by approximately 4 to 6 minutes. Holloway stared at her. Which eliminates your window, she said. The room was completely silent. Holloway looked at Beckett. Beckett was already on his laptop, pulling up the raw sensor feeds from the surveillance aircraft. The unprocessed data that ran beneath the cleaned and compiled imagery that the mission briefing had been built from. His eyes moved across the screen quickly. Then he stopped. He looked up at Holloway. And the expression on Beckett's face, the face of a man who had spent 23 years in the military, never once allowing surprise to show, was unmistakable. She was right. The interference pattern was there. Faint but structured. Not random, not natural. Someone had been deliberately shaping the electronic environment around the extraction zone, and it had been so carefully calibrated just below the threshold that would trigger an automated alert that the mission planning system had filed it as atmospheric variation and moved on. Holloway set down his pointer. He did not look at the woman in the chair. He looked at the screen. How long has this pattern been active? He asked, and he was asking the room, or maybe he was asking Beckett, but the voice that answered was hers. At least 72 hours, she said. Based on the satellite archive data, it was in place before we finalized the extraction route. The implication of that landed in the room like something falling from a shelf. Before they finalized the extraction route. Before the mission plan was locked, the interference was already there. Already positioned, already waiting. Which meant one of two things. Either it was an extraordinary coincidence, a hostile electronic warfare element that happened to be operating in exactly the sector that American mission planners later chose as their extraction corridor, or it wasn't a coincidence at all. Where's the signal originating? Beckett asked. She had already pulled it up. The trace data was on the screen before the question finished. Holloway followed the line. It didn't point toward the enemy compound. It didn't point toward any external hostile position. It pointed toward a relay station, a communications relay station that was part of the task force's own network infrastructure. The signal was coming from inside. The room stopped breathing. Holloway heard Reyes easygoing, rarely serious. Petty Officer Reyes quietly say something under his breath that he couldn't quite make out, but that sounded very much like an expletive. Beckett stood up slowly, the way a large man moves when he is being very deliberate about not making a sudden noise. Someone is running a false picture through our own relay, Holloway said. Not a question. A man hearing himself say something he needed to hear aloud to fully believe. Yes, she said. And the extraction window, Beckett said, wasn't the only thing they changed. She said she switched the display. The tactical map of the compound sector came back up, but now with the adjusted data layered over it, the corrected imagery, the real positions, the unmanipulated picture of what the compound and its surroundings actually look like versus what the mission plan had shown. And what the mission plan had shown was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not a small calibration error that would have been corrected in the field. Wrong in a way that would have mattered enormously to 8 men moving through a dark riverbed toward a compound surrounded by armed guards. The enemy observation post that the briefing showed positioned to the north. The one Holloway's eastern approach route had been carefully designed to stay out of sight of wasn't to the north. It was above the riverbed, overlooking it directly. The approach route that 2 SEAL elements were planning to use in less than 3 hours would have walked them directly beneath an enemy position with a clear line of sight to the entire channel. Holloway looked at the screen for a long time. The operations room had gone from a controlled pre-mission briefing environment to something different, something quieter and more charged. The kind of quiet that fills a room when experienced, capable people realize simultaneously that they were moving towards something they didn't see. Beckett broke it. "She didn't fix the plan," he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. Then he looked at Holloway. "She stopped us from walking into a trap." Holloway didn't answer. I was still looking at the screen. Because Aaron Beckett was right. If the mission had launched on schedule with the briefing as presented, 2 SEAL elements would have entered a riverbed with an enemy observation post, looking directly down at them in a sector where their helicopter extraction window had already been eliminated, navigating by a tactical picture that was feeding them deliberately falsified position data. It would not have been a rescue mission. It would have been a catastrophe. Holloway turned to look at her. She was watching him. Not with satisfaction, not with the quiet glow of someone who has just proven a point. She was watching him the way a surgeon watches a patient after delivering difficult news, with the focused attention of someone who has more work to do and needs to know how the other person is processing before they proceed. "Who are you?" Holloway said. It came out differently than he intended. Not commanding, not the voice of a man asserting his authority over an unwelcome visitor. Just a man asking a question he genuinely needed the answer to. "The person General Whitmore ordered to be here," she said. Holloway opened his mouth, and then the alert came. Not a soft notification chime. A priority alert, the kind that overrides everything else in the room and fills the speakers with a tone that every person in the building has been trained since their first week to respond to immediately. Kane stepped toward the communications station, his face pale, his movements slightly too fast. "Hostages are moving," he said. "Thermal imagery shows vehicle preparation at the compound. They're loading." The mission clock changed. 90 minutes, maybe less. And the tactical picture supporting the mission was still wrong. The extraction corridor was still compromised. And somewhere inside their own network, someone was actively working to make sure Operation Silent Lantern failed. Holloway looked at the woman with the tablet. He had spent the last 40 minutes in a room where everyone laughed at her. Right now, she was the only person in that room with answers. "What do we do?" he asked. And for the first time, something changed in her expression. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Focus. Your total mission-oriented focus. "We fixed the picture," she said, starting with what they changed and working backward to who had access to change it. "We have 90 minutes, Holloway said. "I know," she said. "Can you do it in 90 minutes? She was already working. "I can do it in 60, she said. "But I'm going to need every sensor feed you have, direct access to the relay station logs, and I need someone to keep Kane away from that communications terminal." The room went very still at the sound of that name. Kane. Lieutenant Commander Trevor Kane, who was standing 12 feet away, reviewing satellite imagery printouts, and who had just heard every word she said. He looked up slowly. His face was completely expressionless, which was, Holloway realized in that instant, unusual. Because Kane was a man who always had a response, always had a professional, articulate, measured response to every development in a mission environment. He was known for it. The man who could talk you through a crisis. Right now, he had no expression at all, and in Holloway's experience, there was only one category of person who heard their own name associated with an active security concern and responded with a face like a blank wall. Someone who had already decided what they were going to do next. Holloway moved, not toward Kane, toward the door where 2 of his operators were positioned. "Reyes," he said, his voice perfectly flat, "stay close to the LCOM." Kane's head turned toward Holloway. "Grant, what he said. Whatever she's suggesting, I think we need to hear the evidence before—" "Evidence first," the woman at the table said. Her voice cut across Kane's cleanly, without heat, without accusation. Just steady and certain. "Name second." Kane looked at her. She looked back at him. And in the silence between them, in the particular quality of that eye contact, the measuring, the assessment, the 2 people who both understand that what is happening in this room is no longer just about a mission, Holloway watched something shift. And he had spent his career learning to read people in high-stakes environments. It was a survival skill, the ability to look at a face in a crisis and understand in 3 seconds who that person actually was underneath everything they projected. He looked at Kane, and for the first time in the years he had known Trevor Kane, the competent, well-regarded, professionally respected Lieutenant Commander Grant Holloway wasn't certain who he was looking at. The woman opened a new window on the relay station logs. 60 minutes, she had said. And the mission clock said 90. And somewhere in the gap between those two numbers, 5 American aid workers were being loaded into vehicles. The compromised intelligence picture was still feeding false data through American relay infrastructure, and the most important question in the room had nothing to do with the tactical display. It was the question that Beckett was now watching her with the question that Holloway was carrying, but hadn't asked yet, the question that was sitting in the room like a third presence waiting. Who was she? Not rank, not title, not the answer she had given the person Whitmore sent. Who was she that Whitmore had sent her? Who was she that she had walked into this room without announcement and without apology and sat in the chair beside the primary display and spent 40 minutes watching a mission plan she already knew was broken, watching the men in the room who had laughed at her, watching the picture that someone had corrupted and letting it play out exactly long enough to understand it completely? Holloway pulled a chair and sat down beside her. For the first time since she walked through the door, he was no longer standing over her. He was sitting next to her. "Tell me what you need," he said. She didn't acknowledge the shift, didn't remark on it. She simply told him what she needed, and he got it for her, and the work began. Outside the operations center, the desert was just beginning to get its first light. And somewhere beyond that light, 5 people who didn't know a woman named Major Claire Donovan existed were depending on her in ways they would never fully understand. The mission clock on the wall read 87 minutes remaining. Claire didn't look at it. She already knew exactly what it said. She had 3 independent intelligence streams pulled up on her tablet, simultaneously drone imagery from the surveillance aircraft still circling the sector. Raw airborne radar data that had been running in the background since 4 in the morning, and a commercial satellite feed she had requested access to 48 hours ago through a channel that nobody in this room knew existed. She had been preparing for the possibility that the primary intelligence picture would be compromised. She had not known for certain, but she had suspected enough to build a backup before she ever walked through that door. That was the thing about Claire Donovan, that the men in this room were only now beginning to understand. She didn't react to crises, she anticipated them. She built the scaffolding before the building showed any sign of falling, and by the time everyone else was looking at the damage, she was already standing inside the structure she had quietly constructed while they weren't watching. Holloway sat beside her now, his coffee forgotten and cold 3 feet away, his eyes moving between her tablet and the main display screen with the focused intensity of a man who had just been handed a completely different version of a situation he thought he understood. "Walk me through the 3 feeds," he said. Not a command, a request. The difference was subtle but real, and Beckett, standing just behind Holloway's left shoulder, heard it and filed it away without comment. Claire pulled up the first overlay. "Drone imagery gives us current ground positions," she said, "but the drone has been working off the compromised targeting data for the last 6 hours. So everything it shows us about enemy positions has to be cross-referenced against the other 2 feeds before we treat it as reliable. Meaning the drone itself is clean, but the information feeding its targeting system isn't," Holloway said. "Exactly. So the aircraft is fine. The picture it's been given to work from is not." "Yes," Holloway absorbed that. "Then how much of what we briefed this morning is still accurate?" Claire was quiet for 2 seconds, not because she didn't know the answer, because she was deciding how to deliver it. "The location of the compound is accurate," she said. "The number of hostages is accurate based on thermal imagery. The general hostile force size is in the right range. Everything else needs to be verified." "Everything else," Holloway repeated. "Enemy positions, patrol patterns, guard rotations, the approach route, the extraction zone, the timing on the interference window." She paused. "Everything that turns a location into a plan." The room was quiet enough that Holloway could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Reyes, sitting near the back wall, exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't smiling now. He hadn't smiled since the moment Beckett's expression had changed over the raw sensor data. That expression, Aaron Beckett, 23 years unshakable, showing something that looked like genuine alarm. That had been the moment for most of the operators in the room when the morning shifted from a pre-mission briefing into something else entirely. 84 minutes, Beckett said, quietly reading the clock. "I know," Claire said, and she was already on the second feed. The airborne radar data was cleaner. Unprocessed direct from the aircraft's sensors without passing through the relay station that had been compromised. Claire had requested a raw feed specifically because she didn't trust the processed version. The processed version went through the relay, got cleaned and formatted and organized by a system that someone had already demonstrated they could reach into and manipulate. The raw data was ugly. It required interpretation. It required someone who understood what they were looking at without the benefit of automated processing. Claire understood it. She marked positions on the tactical map with quick, precise movements, layering the radar data over the drone imagery, building a corrected picture, point by point. Holloway watched her work and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She was moving fast and she was moving accurately, and anything he added right now would only slow her down. Beckett moved closer to the screen. "That observation post," he said, pointing to a position she had just marked. "That's directly above the eastern riverbed approach." "Yes," Claire said. "We would have walked right under it?" "Yes." Beckett was quiet for a moment. "Then how many personnel?" "Thermal shows 3, possibly 4. They've been stationary for approximately 5 hours, which suggests they set up before dark and have been waiting." "Waiting for us," Holloway said. "Waiting for someone," Claire said. "They knew the general time frame. They may not have known the exact approach route, but they positioned for the most logical option, which was also our option." Holloway stood up and walked 2 steps away from the table, then came back. It was the closest thing to pacing that a man like Grant Holloway allowed himself in a room full of people he needed to project certainty to. 2 steps, back, controlled. "The mission is still viable," he said. It was half statement, half question. "The mission is viable," Claire confirmed. "The plan, as briefed, is not. We need a different approach route, a corrected extraction zone, and we need the interference in the western corridor addressed before the helicopters enter the sector." "Can the interference be addressed?" "That depends on whether we can identify and isolate the source before launch." Holloway looked at Kane. Kane was standing near the communications terminal, his expression carefully neutral, his eyes tracking the conversation without offering anything. He had been like that since Claire said his name 40 minutes ago, measured, composed, professional. Every instinct in Holloway's body was screaming something at him about that composure that he wasn't ready to name out loud yet. "Trevor," Holloway said, "I need you away from that terminal." Kane's jaw tightened fractionally. "Grant, if there's a signal integrity issue with the relay, I should be the one managing it. That's literally my responsibility." "And I appreciate that," Holloway said. "Reyes, stay with the LCOM." "Commander Trevor." Holloway's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm running a precautionary separation protocol while we work an active security concern. You know the procedure." Kane stared at him for a long 3 seconds. Then he stepped back from the terminal and folded his arms across his chest. The room exhaled without making a sound. Claire was already on the relay station logs. The logs were dense, tens of thousands of lines of automated system entries, timestamps, access records, signal routing data. Finding evidence of deliberate manipulation inside that volume of automated noise was like finding a single altered word in a library of books. It required knowing exactly what you were looking for and exactly where to look. Claire knew. She had spent 11 years building the kind of cross-domain expertise that most military officers never develop because most military officers spend their careers in a single specialty. She had started in signals intelligence. Then she had moved into joint operational planning, then into cyber defense, then into the specific classified domain of identifying how hostile intelligence services attempted to corrupt American military command and control systems, not by attacking them directly, which triggered every alarm in the network, but by slipping into the seams between systems, into the handoffs between platforms, into the automated processing layers where human eyes rarely went. She had written a classified study on exactly this methodology 18 months ago. The manipulation she was looking at now matched her own described attack pattern almost precisely. She stopped for exactly 1 second when she realized that. Then she kept working. 79 minutes, Beckett said. Claire didn't look up. "I need the authorization logs for the relay maintenance channel. Last 96 hours. One of the communications technicians pulled them up and routed them to her station. She scanned them. Then she went very still. Holloway saw it. He had been watching her with the attention of a man who was now calibrating his rate of the situation almost entirely through her reactions, because she had demonstrated in the last 40 minutes that her reactions were reliable. When she was calm, there was no immediate danger. When she stopped the way, she just stopped, something had changed. "What?" he said. She pointed to a line in the log. It was an access entry, a maintenance channel access record from 31 hours ago. The kind of routine entry that the automated system flagged green and moved past without additional review because the authorization credentials associated with it were valid, legitimate, verified. The credentials belonged to Lieutenant Commander Trevor Kane. The room didn't make a sound. Holloway read the entry twice. "That could be routine," Kane said from across the room. His voice was steady, completely steady. "I access that channel regularly for legitimate maintenance. You know that, Grant. This is exactly the kind of thing that looks significant out of context and means nothing in context." "You're right," Claire said. She was still looking at the screen. "One access entry means nothing. Let me show you the other 6. She pulled them up. 6 entries, spread across 96 hours, all maintenance channel access, all under Kane's credentials, all occurring within 30-minute windows following updates to the mission planning files for Operation Silent Lantern. Every time the plan changed, the relay data changed to match. The timing was not a coincidence. It could not be a coincidence." Holloway stood up very slowly. He turned to look at Kane. And Kane, composed, professional, 24-hour, Trevor Kane, who always had the right thing to say, looked back at him and said nothing. That silence was its own answer. "Trevor," Holloway said. His voice was completely quiet, the quietest it had been all morning. "Tell me there's an explanation." Kane's eyes moved to Claire, then to Beckett, then back to Holloway. "I want to talk to a lawyer," he said. The room detonated. Not literally, not with sound, with pressure. The kind of pressure that builds in a sealed space when every person in it simultaneously realizes that something they trusted completely has been broken. Reyes stepped directly in front of Kane. Beckett moved to the communications terminal and began running a full diagnostic to identify every channel Kane had touched. 2 other operators moved to the door without being asked, positioning themselves without discussion, the way men do when they have operated together long enough that certain responses become automatic. Holloway stood in the middle of the room, and for 3 full seconds, he didn't move. 20 years, nearly 2 decades of operations of missions that depended on every person in the planning chain doing their job with absolute integrity. He had trusted Trevor Kane, had worked alongside him for 4 years, had sat in briefings with him, built plans with him, relied on the intelligence picture Kane's section produced to make decisions that put his men's lives at risk. And Kane had been feeding that picture through a corrupted channel. Holloway wanted to feel rage. What he felt instead was something colder and more specific. The particular emotion of a man who realizes that an enemy didn't defeat him. An enemy got help from inside. He breathed. "Secure him," he said. Reyes and another operator moved Kane to the corner of the room calmly and professionally, and Kane went without resistance. He looked in that moment less like a traitor and more like a man who had been running for a very long time and had simply stopped. Holloway turned back to Claire. "How much of the interference in the extraction corridor can be neutralized if we cut the relay access he was using?" "Most of it," she said. She was already working on it. The interference was being fed through the relay signal. If we isolate that channel and route the helicopter's navigation through the backup system, instead we recover approximately 5 minutes of the window. Which gives us how long? Combined with the adjusted approach timing, you're looking at 6.5 minutes inside the extraction zone. I planned for 8. 6.5 is workable, she said, with a tighter insertion and a pre-positioned extraction point. Holloway looked at Beckett. Beckett nodded once. Tight. 6.5 minutes was tight. It was the kind of tight where everything had to work and nothing could go wrong. But it was not impossible. And in their world, not impossible was sometimes the best option available. 71 minutes, Beckett said. New approach route, Holloway said to Claire. What are you thinking? She pulled up the satellite over him and pointed to a fold in the terrain approximately 400 meters south of the riverbed, a natural depression partially shielded from the observation post above that offered a viable covered approach toward the compound's western perimeter, rather than the eastern entry the original plan had specified. Western approach is longer, Holloway said immediately, adds 12 minutes of ground time. Yes, Claire said, but the observation post has no line of sight to the western perimeter, and the guard rotation on that side She pulled up the corrected thermal imagery, has a 7-minute gap at the 40-minute mark from now. Holloway stared at the timing. 71 minutes to launch, 12 minutes added to ground approach, 7-minute guard rotation gap at the 40-minute mark. The numbers were tight enough to make his teeth ache, but they worked. If everything moved precisely, if his team hit their marks with the kind of disciplined timing that came from years of training, numbers worked. Reyes goes with the secondary element, he said, thinking aloud now. We split at the compound perimeter. Primary team takes the main structure. Secondary holds the western approach and handles any hostile vehicle response. Agreed, Claire said. Aviation element needs the updated extraction coordinates no later than 50 minutes from now to recalculate their ingress. I'm building that package now, Claire said. They'll have it in 20 minutes. Holloway stopped. He looked at her. Not the assessment he'd been running all morning, the recalibrating, repositioning evaluation of a man adjusting his understanding of who he was dealing with. Something more direct than that, just a man looking at a person doing extraordinary work under extraordinary pressure and allowing himself for one unguarded moment to see it clearly. You suspected an internal leak before you walked in this morning, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. That's why you didn't announce your role. General Whitmore wanted to observe how information moved when people believed I was an outsider, she said. If someone was selectively passing information, the briefing was an opportunity to identify gaps between what was said in this room and what appeared in the relay logs afterward. Holloway absorbed that. You used yourself as the variable, he said. Yes. Knowing I would, he stopped. Yes, she said, again, showing no accusation in it, no performance. Just a clean, factual yes. Holloway said nothing for a moment. Then I owe you an apology. Later, she said, and she meant it practically, not dismissively. Right now, I need you to get your team ready to move in 63 minutes on a completely different approach vector than the one they memorized this morning. And just like that, Grant Holloway was back in the mission. He crossed the room to his operators, and Claire listened to him begin the rebrief. His voice precise, no wasted words, no visible indication to his men that 20 minutes ago he had been standing at the edge of something that shook him. He presented the modified plan with the clarity of a man who had already processed what needed processing and set it aside until later, because later was when it would be safe to feel it. That Claire thought was the thing she had to respect about him. Whatever else he was, whatever the arrogance, the assumptions, the careless cruelty of lost sweetheart, delivered in front of a room full of men who laughed because he laughed first, he was a professional when it mattered. He processed fast. He adapted. He led. She turned back to the relay logs. She still had work to do. The interference in the extraction corridor was the immediate problem. She had identified Kane's access pattern, but neutralizing the interference itself required more than just cutting his channel. Whoever had recruited Kane in the logs made it increasingly clear that Kane had been a conduit, not an architect, had built redundancy into the system. Two separate signal inputs were generating the interference, not one. Kane had controlled one. The second was still active. She traced it. 49 minutes remaining to launch. The second signal was cleaner, more carefully buried. Whoever set it up had done so with more technical sophistication than the first, less dependent on human access, more automated, designed to continue running even if the primary channel was compromised. It was, Claire realized as she traced it further, a professional job. Not improvised, not opportunistic, planned well in advance by someone who understood how to build persistence into a compromised system. She kept following it. The signal routed through two relay nodes before she found the origin point. And when she found it, she sat very still for a moment that was almost identical to the moment 30 minutes ago. The stillness of a person processing something that requires processing before it can be spoken aloud. Then she picked up the secure handset and dialed General Whitmore directly. He answered on the first ring. Tell me, he said. He already knew something had developed. He had been monitoring the room's communications from his own command station. The relay interference has two inputs, Claire said. Kane controlled one. The second is automated. It was seeded through the network maintenance system 14 days ago using credentials from this facility's technical support division. 14 days, Whitmore said. Before the mission was formally designated, Claire said. Before Silent Lantern had a name. Silence on the line. Someone knew we were planning this operation before we told anyone we were planning this operation. Whitmore said. Yes, sir. Another silence. Can you neutralize the second signal? I can isolate it, Claire said. Cutting it completely without triggering a countermeasure response requires physical access to the relay hardware. I need a technician with proper clearance at the relay station within the next... She checked the clock, 38 minutes. You'll have 1 in 20, Whitmore said, and the line went quiet. Claire set down the handset. Across the room, Holloway had finished the modified brief. His team was on their feet checking equipment, running through the adapted plan with the focused physical energy of men, converting information into muscle memory. The atmosphere had changed. The loose pre-mission ease had been replaced by something tighter and more deliberate, the particular quality of professional attention that emerges when people understand that the situation is genuinely serious and that they are the ones responsible for handling it. Beckett appeared at Claire's shoulder. 44 minutes, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then the second signal, can we launch before it's neutralized? If we launch before it's neutralized, the helicopter's navigation systems will degrade during the extraction approach, Claire said. They'll still be able to fly, but precision approaches become significantly more difficult. Difficult or impossible? In good conditions, difficult. If the degradation compounds, she paused, it becomes a judgment call. Beckett looked at the clock, then at her. What's your call? My call is we wait for the technician and we neutralize it before we launch. That cuts our window if the hostages keep moving. Yes, Beckett absorbed that. And if they move out of range before we can launch, Claire looked at him directly. Then we adapt the mission profile again and we go anyway, she said. But I am not sending helicopters into a degraded navigation environment over hostile territory if I have the option to prevent it. I'm not trading pilot lives for a tighter timeline. Beckett held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The slow, considered nod of a man who has just measured someone against a standard he carries internally and found them equal to it. 38 minutes, he said. Holloway appeared from across the room. Status on the second signal, he said. Technician is en route to the relay station, Claire said. 20 minutes out. We should have it neutralized with time to spare before launch. Should, Holloway said. Should, Claire confirmed. She didn't soften it. She didn't hedge it or wrap it in reassurance. She gave him the accurate word and let him carry it. He nodded. And the approach. Western vector is solid. Guard rotation gap still holds. I've updated the aviation package. Pilots have the new extraction coordinates. They're comfortable with 6.5 minutes. Lead pilot says 6.5 is tight but executable, Claire said. His words were, I've worked tighter. I believe him. Holloway almost smiled. Almost. He turned back to his team. Claire returned to the relay logs. The room had found its rhythm now. The controlled, focused rhythm of people working a problem with everything they have, not because someone ordered them to, but because 5 human beings were somewhere in that desert, and coming home depended entirely on the work happening in this room right now. 26 minutes to the technician's arrival at the relay station. 39 minutes to launch window. Kane sat in the corner of the room under guard, his arms folded, his face completely blank. He had not spoken since requesting a lawyer. He had watched the room work around him, had watched the plan he tried to destroy, being rebuilt piece by the woman they had laughed at, and he had said nothing. At one point, Holloway walked past him on his way to the communications terminal. He stopped. He looked at Kane for a long moment, the face of a man he had trusted, the man who had sat in briefings with him, the man who had laughed with the rest of them when Holloway made his joke that morning, and something moved through Holloway's expression that was too complex to name. Grief was part of it. Betrayal, a specific military kind of fury that lived beneath everything else, like bedrock. Why, Holloway said, just the one word. Kane looked at him. For a moment, something cracked in that blank expression. Something human moved underneath it, something tired and cornered and old. It started small, Kane said. His voice was low, nearly inaudible. It started so small, Grant. I didn't... He stopped, shook his head. It doesn't matter. 5 people are out there, Holloway said. It matters. Kane looked away. Holloway moved on. Claire had heard every word. She kept her eyes on her screen. 21 minutes. The technician reached the relay station in 19. The second signal went dark 2 minutes later. The interference in the extraction corridor dropped to zero. The helicopter navigation systems came back clean. And Brigadier General Robert Whitmore walked through the secure door of the operations center at exactly 31 minutes before launch window, looked around the room with eyes that took in everything simultaneously, and said 4 words. Are we ready to go? Holloway looked at Claire. Claire looked at the display, the corrected intelligence picture, the verified approach route, the clean navigation channels, the thermal imagery of 4 visible hostages in the main structure, and she looked again at something in the corner of the screen that had been bothering her for the last 12 minutes. Something she had been tracking in the background while managing everything else. Something that had just now resolved into a shape that changed the picture again. 4 hostages, not 5. The thermal imagery was showing 4 heat signatures in the main compound building. 1 American was missing. Claire zoomed in on the secondary structure, a maintenance building nearly half a mile from the main compound, outside the original mission footprint entirely. A single heat signature, stationary, small. She stood up. General, she said, we have a problem. The room went completely still. Whitmore crossed to Claire's station in 4 long strides and looked at the screen. Holloway was right behind him. Beckett followed without being asked because Beckett always followed when the picture changed. 4 heat signatures in the main building. 1 in the maintenance structure 460 meters to the northwest. When did that signature appear, Whitmore said. It was there when I first pulled the corrected thermal feed, Claire said. I flagged it as a possible equipment artifact because the building showed as empty in the original intelligence. I've been tracking it for 12 minutes. It hasn't moved. It's been stationary long enough that I'm now confident it's a person, not a mechanical heat source. 1 of the 5, Holloway said. Almost certainly, Claire said. The signature size and heat distribution is consistent with a human being in a resting or restrained position. Whitmore looked at the distance between the 2 structures. 460 meters. In mission terms, 460 meters might as well be 4 miles. It was outside the original assault footprint, outside the extraction timing window, outside every calculation the plan had been built around. Can we adjust, Whitmore said. I was asking Claire, not Holloway, not Beckett. Claire. Holloway noticed. He absorbed it without comment. We have to, Claire said. We are not leaving an American behind because they moved 1 person to a building we didn't account for. That is not an acceptable outcome. Agreed, Whitmore said immediately. What do you need? Claire was already looking at the assets available. She had the 2 SEAL elements, the surveillance aircraft, the electronic warfare package, the helicopter extraction element, and an Army reconnaissance team that had been positioned in the broader sector for a separate exercise that morning and had been placed on standby when Silent Lantern moved to active status. The reconnaissance team was 3 vehicles, 12 soldiers positioned approximately 8 kilometers from the compound perimeter. She had been thinking about them since she first saw the secondary heat signature. I need Holloway's primary element to proceed to the main structure on the modified western approach, she said. Secondary SEAL element splits and handles the hostile vehicle response as planned. And I need the Army reconnaissance element repositioned to isolate the maintenance building, while a small extraction team, no more than 3 operators, approaches from the north. Holloway's head turned. You want to split my team 3 ways, he said. Yes. That's not how SEALs operate. I know, Claire said. That's how this mission operates. Right now, given what we're looking at. Holloway stared at the screen. He was running it in his head, the timing, the angles, the risk distribution, the way 3 simultaneous actions would stretch his command and control to its absolute limit. He was looking for the flaw. He was looking for the part where it fell apart. He couldn't find it. He hated that he couldn't find it. Who commands the 3rd element, he said. Senior operator on the secondary SEAL team volunteers, or you designate, Claire said. That decision is yours. I'm not making personnel calls. That surprised him. She had just restructured the entire mission architecture in the span of 90 seconds, and she had stopped precisely at the line where the call belonged to him. He turned to Beckett. Beckett was already looking at him with the answer in his eyes. They had operated together long enough that some conversations happened entirely without words. Petty Officer Garza, Holloway said. Beckett nodded. Garza was the secondary element's most experienced operator. If you were going to send 3 people to an unknown building to recover a hostage, With 400 meters of open ground and an army element for outer cordon, you sent the person who had done the most with the least the most times. Get him briefed, Holloway said. Beckett moved. 26 minutes to launch, Claire said. Holloway turned back to the main display. The Army reconnaissance element. Can they reposition in time? Their element leader says 18 minutes to the new position, Claire said. I spoke with him 6 minutes ago. Holloway stopped, looked at her. You already called them. I flagged the possibility to their element leader as soon as I was confident. The secondary signature was a person, Claire said. I didn't issue an order. I gave him a heads up that the mission picture might require repositioning and asked him to confirm his timing. Without telling me, without issuing an order, Claire said. The distinction was precise and intentional. The moment the decision was made, it was going to you and General Whitmore. I was working the timeline. Holloway held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he nodded. Because she was right. Because she had saved 6 minutes of preparation time by making a phone call that was within her authority to make, and in a mission where every minute was load-bearing, 6 minutes was enormous. And because, though he would not have admitted it 10 minutes ago, he was beginning to understand that Claire Donovan operated several moves ahead of the current moment at all times. And the smart response to that was not resistance. It was to trust it and move. 23 minutes, Beckett said from across the room where he was pulling Garza aside and beginning the abbreviated briefing. Whitmore put a hand briefly on Claire's shoulder, not a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement, the kind that passes between professionals who have worked together long enough to dispense with formality and then move to the communications station to brief the aviation element on the updated extraction picture. The room was moving now. Not with the anxious energy of people responding to a crisis, but with the focused, contained velocity of people executing a plan they understood and trusted. The atmosphere had transformed completely in the hour since Claire walked through the door. The operators who had laughed that morning were the same men now running modified approach routes through their heads, checking equipment for the 3rd time, confirming communications frequencies and abort criteria, with the particular precision that comes from knowing the difference between good enough and exactly right. She had done that, not by demanding their respect, not by announcing her authority, by being right when it mattered, and being right again and again until there was no longer any question in the room about whether she knew what she was doing. Garza appeared at her station. He was 34 years old, built like a door with a crew cut, and he had the calm eyes of someone who had stopped being impressed by difficult situations somewhere around his 5th operational deployment. 3 of us to the maintenance building, he said. It wasn't a question. He had been briefed. He was confirming. Army element establishes outer cordon before you move, Claire said. You wait for their confirmation before you breach. Non-negotiable. Garza looked at her steadily. What's the structural layout? She pulled up the satellite imagery of the maintenance building. Single story, 2 entry points, main door on the south face, emergency access on the east. Thermal shows the hostage on the north interior wall. 1 guard heat signature near the south entry. 1 guard, Garza said. 1 visible, Claire said. Assume 2. The second may be outside the building's thermal footprint. Garza absorbed this. Comms with the primary element. Shared frequency. You'll hear everything we hear from Holloway's team. Priority traffic override is yours. If you need it, use the hotel code. Understood. He paused for exactly 1 second, the pause of a man who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. Major, that second building. If our window collapses and we can't get the Army element in position in time, then I delay the primary assault until you are in position, Claire said. I will not launch the main element until you have outer cordon. We go together or we don't go. Something in Garza's face settled, not relief exactly, the particular quality of a professional who needed one specific assurance before committing himself completely, and who has received it in precise and unambiguous terms. Copy that, he said, and then he walked back to his 2-man element and began final preparations with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is about to do. 17 minutes to launch. Claire turned back to her screen, and then Kane spoke. Nobody expected it. He had been silent for nearly 40 minutes in his corner of the room, watching everything unfold, his face that same disturbing blank. And then, without warning, his voice came across the room with a clarity that made 3 operators turn simultaneously. The maintenance building has a basement, he said, Every head in the room rotated toward him. Kane was looking at the tactical display. His arms were still folded. His voice was completely flat. It's not in any of the imagery because the access point is interior. Trapdoor in the northeast corner of the main floor. There's a sub-level storage area approximately 4 meters below grade. The room was absolutely silent. Holloway took 3 steps toward him. How do you know that? Because the people who planned this operation gave me the original compound schematic, Kane said. The real one, before I started passing them information about the mission. The basement level was deliberately excluded from the intelligence package we built for the briefing. Claire was already pulling up everything available on the maintenance structure. They put the hostage in the basement, she said. Not a question. The thermal signature stationary consistent, positioned against the north wall, matched a person in a basement far more precisely than a person on the main floor. Heat rising from below. The signature slightly diffuse. She had been reading it as a resting position. It was a below-grade position. Why are you telling us this? Whitmore said. He had crossed the room and was standing directly in front of Kane, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 3 decades in command and knew exactly how to occupy space. Kane looked at him, and for the first time since he had asked for a lawyer, something moved in his face. It wasn't remorse exactly. It was something older and heavier, the expression of a man who has been carrying something he can no longer hold. Because I didn't sign up for this, Kane said. His voice was low. I sold logistics information. Convoy routes, equipment schedules. I didn't know it was going to get here. I didn't know people were going to be... He stopped. His jaw worked. I didn't know it was going to get here. But it did, Whitmore said. Yes, sir, Kane said. It did. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. The basement access, Claire said. Her voice was level, professional. She did not give Kane grief or absolution. She gave him the next question. Single trap door. Yes, Kane said. Hinged north side. Padlocked from the exterior. Guarded unknown. The schematic I received didn't show personnel deployment. Claire looked at Garza across the room. He had heard everything. Change of entry plan, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man rerouting himself. Northeast interior, trap door, padlock, Claire confirmed. You breach the main floor, first secure the guard, then access the basement. Army cordon holds the perimeter throughout. Copy, Garza said. 14 minutes.
I'm going to Rachel, he said. I'm going to give her this report and everything in it. No conditions, no negotiations, just the truth. And me. Adrian looked at his mother for a long moment. I'm removing you from the foundation board, he said. Effective today, and I need you to understand something clearly. Any relationship you ever have with those children depends entirely on Rachel's decision, not mine, hers. He stood, picked up the folders. You took something from her that she can never get back. That means she gets to decide what comes next. Not you, not me. He was at the door when Margaret said his name. He stopped, did not turn.
He's going to be a better commander because of this morning, Beckett said. Whatever else happens, that matters. Claire held his gaze for a moment. Get your team out safe, Master Chief, she said. That's what matters right now. Beckett nodded and went. 11 minutes to launch. The operations center settled into the particular controlled quiet of a room where everything that can be prepared has been prepared and what remains is the waiting. Claire moved through a final check navigation channels, clean communications frequencies, confirmed aviation element, holding at standby, Army reconnaissance, element confirming position in 7 minutes, Garza's 3-man team equipment, verified primary SEAL element, staged and ready. Everything was as ready as it was going to be. Whitmore stood beside her. When this is over, he said quietly, I'm putting your name on the after-action report exactly as it should appear. When this is over, Claire said, I want to debrief every decision I made this morning, including the ones I made too slowly. Whitmore looked at her sidelong. You know, most commanders spend their debrief time explaining why every decision they made was correct, he said. I know, Claire said. He almost smiled. The launch clock hit 0. Holloway's voice came through the command net steady and controlled. Primary element moving. Garza, third element moving. The Army reconnaissance element leader, cordon moving, estimated position in 6 minutes. And then the room went into that particular quality of silence, that only exists when people are moving in the field and the people in the command center are tracking them, and there is nothing left to do but watch the picture and be ready to respond. Claire watched the thermal feeds. Primary SEAL element moving through the western approach. 8 signatures moving in pairs tight and precise, exactly on the modified route she had built from the corrected intelligence. Their pace was controlled. Their spacing was right. They moved the way people move when they are very good at this and they know exactly where they are going. Holloway didn't narrate. He moved. Third element, Garza and 2 operators approaching the maintenance building. From the north, staying low, using the terrain, the way the Army reconnaissance element had confirmed was viable when they reached their cordon position. Army cordon confirmation came in at 6 minutes, 11 seconds. Garza, you are clear to move, Claire said. Moving, Garza confirmed. On the surveillance feed, Claire watched 3 signatures approach the maintenance building. She watched them reach the main door. She watched the entry. Then the feed from inside went dark. The building's materials were interfering with the drone's thermal penetration, and she was flying below Garza's element. Her hand moved involuntarily toward the communications handset. She stopped herself. She had told Garza she would wait for his traffic. She had told him she trusted his judgment inside that building. Calling him now would be noise in his ear at the worst possible moment. She waited. 17 seconds, 23. Then Garza's voice. Main floor secure. 1 guard, moving to northeast corner. Claire closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. On the primary element feed, Holloway's team had reached the compound perimeter. She could see them holding at the western wall, waiting for the guard rotation gate. She had identified the 7-minute window that her corrected intelligence showed would open at precisely this moment. It opened. Move, Holloway said, barely audible on the net. His team moved. Claire tracked them through the compound, watching 8 signatures flow through the perimeter and distribute toward the main structure with the smooth precision of people executing something they have practiced thousands of times in conditions far more difficult than this. 48 seconds to main building breach. In the maintenance structure, Garza's voice again. Trapdoor located. Moving. Silence for 11 seconds. Then contact. Hostage located. Basement level. She's alive. She's a pause. The pause of a man who has just seen something that required a moment before he could continue. She's in rough shape, but she's breathing. We have her, preparing to move. Claire let out a breath she had been holding for 3 minutes. 1 found, 4 to go. On the main compound feed, Holloway's element breached the primary structure simultaneously from 2 entry points, a double entry execution that she had seen planned, but had never personally watched unfold in real time. And even through the abstract medium of thermal imagery, it was viscerally efficient. 8 signatures moving through a building, distributing, clearing, moving again. Then first hostage located, second, third. Holloway's voice was controlled. Counting. 4. Primary structure clear. We have 4. I say again, 4 recovered. Are we good on 5th? 5th is ambulatory, Garza's voice cut in. We are moving to extraction. She needs medical, but she is moving under her own power. Holloway copy, moving to extraction. And that was the moment the vehicle engine started. Claire heard it through the ambient audio feed from the surveillance aircraft, a low-growing rumble from the eastern side of the compound. Not one vehicle. Multiple. Moving fast. She looked at the thermal feed. 4 vehicles coming from the east. Moving toward the compound at speed. ETA to the main structure, approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The helicopters were 8 minutes out. The math was wrong. By 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the math was wrong. Holloway Claire said, you have 4 vehicles inbound from the east. 3 minutes 40 to your position. Helicopters are 8 minutes out. 3 seconds of silence. Copy, Holloway said. His voice was completely steady. Options. Claire was already moving. The extraction zone was compromised. If the helicopters came to the original extraction point, they would arrive at the same time as 4 armed vehicles. That was not an extraction. That was a combat engagement at a landing zone with 5 hostages in the middle of it. She needed to move the extraction. She pulled up the terrain mapping and overlaid it against the helicopter ingress routes, looking for a position that extended the vehicle's travel time while reducing the helicopter's approach angle. She found it in 38 seconds, a depression 700 meters northwest of the compound. accessible from the western approach route that Holloway's team had used on ingress. Holloway new extraction point, 700 meters northwest on your ingress route. Drainage depression. Helicopters are rerouting now. Confirm route is clear, Holloway said. Army element is clearing it, Claire said, and she was already on the secondary net to the Army reconnaissance element leader. I need your vehicles on the eastern track, intercept the hostile convoy, slow them down. You are not engaging to destroy, you are engaging to delay. Buy me 4 minutes. The Army element leader's voice came back without hesitation. Understood. Moving. On the feed, she watched 3 Army vehicles swing east. On the primary feed, she watched Holloway's element plus 4 hostages begin moving northwest through the compound perimeter. On the maintenance building feed, Garza and his element plus 1 hostage were already moving paralleling the primary team's route toward the new extraction point. The helicopters were rerouting. New ETA to the depression, 6 minutes 12 seconds. The hostile vehicles were 3 minutes 20 to the original extraction point. Add the delay the Army element was going to create 2, maybe 3 minutes if they were aggressive about it, and the hostile convoy would reach the new extraction zone in approximately 5 to 6 minutes. 6 minutes 12 seconds for the helicopters. 5 to 6 minutes for the hostile vehicles. The margin was 30 seconds, maybe less. Holloway, Claire said, I need your movement pace. We have 4 hostages who haven't moved under their own power in 2 weeks, Holloway said. His voice was still controlled, but she could hear the effort in it now. We're moving as fast as we can move. Copy, Claire said. You have 5 minutes to the extraction point. Move. She looked at the screen. 8 signatures from the primary element moving northwest. 3 signatures from Garza's element converging from the north. 5 additional heat sources, the hostages distributed among the operators, some moving under their own power, some being carried. The Army vehicles had reached the hostile convoy's approach route and were establishing a blocking position. Weapons fire started appearing as muzzle flashes on the drone feed. Not heavy contact, suppressive, delay. The Army element was doing exactly what Claire had asked, slowing the convoy without committing to a full engagement that would tie them in place. 4 minutes. Helicopters incoming at 5 minutes 50. Garza, Claire said. Status. Moving. Hostage is slowing us down. She's trying, but she's a pause. The sound of exertion. We're going to make it. You're going to make it, Claire confirmed. She said it with complete certainty. She was not completely certain. But Garza didn't need her uncertainty right now. He needed her certainty. And so she gave it to him like a tool, a thing he could pick up and carry. 3 minutes. Hostile vehicles were past the Army blocking position. The delay had cost the convoy approximately 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The Army element leader's voice came through clean. Hostile convoy is through. They're moving toward the compound. Copy, Claire said. Break contact and move northwest. I want you at the extraction zone perimeter. Moving. On the feed, she watched the hostile vehicles reach the original extraction point. Empty. The compound was empty. The vehicles stopped, circled, began scanning. It was going to take them 60 to 90 seconds to identify the new direction of movement and redirect. Maybe more. The depression to the northwest was not visible from the original extraction point. 2 minutes 30 to helicopter arrival. 2 minutes 15 to hostile vehicle identification of the new direction. 15 seconds. The margin was 15 seconds. Holloway's voice broke through. Extraction point in sight. All elements, I see the depression. Moving to position now. Garza, third element, 60 seconds behind primary. Helicopters, 2 minutes. We see your IR markers, inbound. Claire gripped the edge of the station console. On the screen, the thermal feed showed Holloway's element reaching the depression and moving into it, the natural terrain feature she had found in 38 seconds on a terrain map, now sheltering 8 American operators and 4 American hostages from direct observation by 4 hostile vehicles that were 90 seconds from identifying their direction of movement. Garza's element arrived at the depression perimeter. The helicopters appeared on the feed, 2 large heat signatures moving fast and low from the northwest exactly on the rerouted approach she had built. First helicopter touched down, loading began immediately. Second helicopter 30 seconds behind. On the eastern feed, the hostile vehicles had identified the movement direction. They were turning, moving west, moving fast. First helicopter lifted. Hostile vehicles were 45 seconds from the depression. Second helicopter was still on the ground. Garza's element and the fifth hostage were boarding. Go, Claire said. Go now. The second helicopter lifted. 4 seconds later, the first hostile vehicle reached the depression perimeter. It was empty. The sound that moved through the operations center was not a cheer. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of 10 people simultaneously releasing something they had been holding for the last 27 minutes, a collective exhale that moved through the room like a wave and broke against the walls and dissolved. Holloway's voice came through the net. Primary secure. 4 recovered. A pause. All of them breathing, all of them home. Then Garza. Secondary secure. 5th hostage recovered. She's okay, Claire. She's going to be okay. He used her name, not her rank, her name. Claire stood at the console and looked at the screen for a long moment. On the feed, 2 helicopters moving northwest away from the compound, climbing above the terrain, carrying 9 American operators and 5 American hostages who were alive because a room full of people had rebuilt a broken plan in under 2 hours and then executed it against a moving target with 15 seconds of margin. Whitmore's hand came down gently on her shoulder. She looked at him. Well done, Major, he said. Claire looked back at the screen. Debrief in 1 hour, she said. I want to talk about every decision that was 60 seconds slower than it should have been. Whitmore looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had seen a great many people lead a great many operations and had very rarely seen someone respond to success by immediately looking for what they could have done better. He nodded. And across the room, sitting in the corner under guard, Trevor Kane watched the screen showing 2 helicopters moving safely away from a compound he had tried to make lethal, and he put his face in his hands. The room didn't look at him. There was too much work left to do. The helicopters landed at the Nevada facility at 14 minutes past 9 in the morning. Claire was already on the tarmac when they touched down. Not because protocol required it, because she had tracked every one of those operators from the moment they stepped off the vehicles at the compound perimeter to the moment the helicopters lifted, and she was not going to stand inside a building watching a screen when she could stand outside and see them walk off with her own eyes. Whitmore stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. The first helicopter's door opened, and the medical team moved in immediately. 3 personnel who had been staged and waiting since the moment Claire called the 5th hostage's condition over the net. They moved with practiced efficiency, and the operators who had been holding space and providing support stepped back to let them work without being asked, because men like Holloway's team understood exactly when to hold on and when to step away. The hostages came off one at a time. 4 from the first helicopter, 1 from the second. They were in poor condition, dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted, in the deep cellular way that comes from days of captivity and fear. 2 of them were being supported by operators. 1 was on a stretcher, but they were breathing, they were conscious, they were here. The 5th hostage, the woman from the basement, came off Garza's helicopter, supported between Garza and one of his operators. She was small, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had been through something it was still processing. But her eyes were open and tracking, and when she reached the tarmac and felt the solid ground under her feet, she stopped walking for exactly 1 second and looked up at the sky, and Claire, watching from 30 feet away, felt something move through her chest that she had no name for and didn't try to name. Garza looked up and found Claire across the tarmac. He gave her a single nod. She gave him one back. Holloway came off last. He was the last one out, the way he always was. Team leader exits last, the same principle in reverse application from entering. He came off the helicopter, still carrying his weapon, still scanning, and he didn't stop scanning until his feet were on the tarmac and he had visually confirmed every member of his team was off the aircraft. Then he found Claire. He walked toward her, not fast, measured. The walk of a man who has just finished something very large and is still in the process of deciding how he feels about it. He stopped in front of her. Up close, the mission showed on him. Dust and exertion. The particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from the sustained mental intensity of leading people through something that could have gone wrong in 8 different ways and didn't. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "All 5. Also 5, Claire confirmed. Holloway nodded slowly. And then something happened that Claire did not expect, and that Beckett, watching from 6 feet away, would later say was the most surprising thing he saw that entire morning. Commander Grant Holloway, Silver Star, 19 years, the man who had pointed at Claire's face and told her the door was that way, extended his hand. Not a formal gesture, not performance, just a man offering his hand to the person who had made the thing he cared most about possible. Claire shook it. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. Whitmore watched them from a few steps back, his expression giving nothing away, the way it never gave anything away. But Beckett caught the general's eyes for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, something passed between them that was as close as 2 military men of that generation came to saying out loud that they had just witnessed something worth witnessing. The medical teams were moving, now getting the hostages toward the facility's medical wing, and the tarmac began to clear. Operators drifted toward the debrief area in small groups, moving with the particular combination of relief and contained energy that comes from the end of a high-stakes mission when the outcome was the right one. The talk was quiet. The humor, when it appeared, was dark and brief in the way military humor always is not, because these men were callous, but because laughter was how they metabolized the distance between what they trained for and what it actually felt like when it was real. Claire watched them and said nothing. She had her own processing to do. She would do it later alone the way she always did. Right now there was a debrief to run. The debrief began at 10:47 in the morning. The same operations room, the same table, the same chairs, but the atmosphere was entirely different from the one that had existed 5 hours earlier when Claire walked in and sat down in the chair beside the tactical display, and Holloway told her the door was that way. Every operator was present. Every senior person who had been in the room during the planning crisis was present. The communications technicians, the surveillance aircraft crew leads, the Army reconnaissance element leader who had driven in from his holding position and arrived still carrying field dust on his uniform. Claire stood at the front of the room. She did not begin with congratulations. She did not begin with a summary of the successful outcome. She opened a document on the primary display that listed 7 decision points from the morning's operation, and she said, "I want to work through each of these, starting with the ones I got wrong." The room went completely quiet. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of surprise, because debriefs in the military generally followed a predictable architecture. What worked, what didn't, lessons learned, recommendations forward. They were professional and they were honest, but they operated within a certain understood framework where the senior leader's decisions were examined carefully, but not usually led with self-criticism from the senior leader herself. Claire was not following the framework. Decision point 1, and she said, the secondary heat signature in the maintenance building. I flagged as a possible equipment artifact for 12 minutes before I elevated it to confirmed human signature. That was 11 minutes too long. I was managing too many parallel tracks, and I deprioritized a data point that should have been resolved faster. If the mission had launched on the original timeline without that correction, we would have left 1 American behind. That is on me. The room absorbed this. Holloway, sitting at the table, watched her say it without hedging, without the small verbal maneuvers that people use to acknowledge error, while simultaneously distancing themselves from its full weight. She just said it, flat and specific and accountable. He had spent his career in rooms where leaders spoke. He had very rarely been in a room where a leader said, "I got this wrong," the way she just said it. Decision point 2, Claire continued, the relay interference isolation. I identified 2 signal inputs, but I committed to a neutralization approach that required a physical technician on site. That was correct. What was not correct was that I did not identify the second input 40 minutes earlier when I first had access to the relay logs. I found it in the second pass. There should not have been a second pass. She moved through them methodically. 7 decision points. 3 where she identified her own performance as insufficient. 2 where she identified coordination gaps between elements. 2 where she credited decisions that worked well and explained why they worked so the room could extract the principle and not just the outcome. When she finished, she looked around the table. "Who wants to go first?" she said. What followed was the most honest debrief that most of the people in that room had ever participated in. Not because Claire demanded honesty, because she had modeled it so completely that anything less felt inadequate by comparison. When a leader stands at the front of a room and says, "Here is where I failed, and here is what it would have cost us," it creates a kind of permission that no memo or policy can manufacture. People told the truth because she made it safe to tell the truth by telling it herself first. Garza talked about the 11 seconds of silence after he entered the maintenance building, the moment when Claire couldn't see his element on the thermal feed, and he knew the command center was flying blind. He said he should have called a status check faster and that he was going to build a standing protocol into his element's procedures that required a verbal confirmation within 10 seconds of any breach, regardless of noise discipline requirements. The Army element leader talked about the blocking position. He said he had hesitated for 4 seconds before committing his vehicles to the intercept because the rules of engagement framing he had been given for the original exercise hadn't been updated when Silent Lantern activated him. 4 seconds in a delay action wasn't catastrophic, but it was 4 seconds he should have had clarity on before the mission went hot, and the gap in his pre-mission brief was something he was going to take back to his unit as a training issue. The surveillance aircraft crew lead talked about the thermal signature interpretation. He said his operators had seen the secondary heat source in the maintenance building before Claire flagged it and had logged it as a possible equipment artifact, the same assessment Claire had made without escalating it. He said the escalation threshold needed to be lower. Any uncharacterized heat source in a mission sector should go to the mission commander immediately, not sit in a log waiting for the next review cycle. Holloway spoke last. He had been sitting at the table for the entire debrief with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes moving between Claire and whoever was speaking, tracking everything with the focused attention of a man who was deciding what to say and how to say it. Claire had noticed but had not rushed him. She had let the debrief move at its own pace. When the room ran out of people who hadn't spoken, Holloway cleared his throat. "I have something to say," he said, "and it's not about the mission." The room settled. Holloway looked at Claire. "When you walked through that door this morning," he said, "I made a decision about who you were before you said a single word. I decided you didn't belong in this room, and I said so. And the way I said it," he stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked briefly. "The way I said it was wrong, not just professionally, as a person. It was wrong." Claire said nothing. "You could have stopped the briefing right then," Holloway continued. "You had the authority. You could have told me who you were and what your role was, and you could have done it in front of everyone in this room, and I would have had no ground to stand on." "Yes," Claire said. "Why didn't you?" The room was very still. Claire looked at him steadily. "Because I needed to know how you treated people you thought couldn't do anything for you," she said. "Not how you treated me when you knew who I was, how you treated me when you thought I was nobody." Holloway absorbed that. "And," he said quietly, "and you told me to leave," Claire said, "in front of your team, using a word you wouldn't have used if I were a man." The word hung in the air. Sweetheart. Nobody said it. Nobody had to. Every person in that room knew exactly what word she meant and why it mattered. Holloway nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting something he had earned. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," Claire said. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Completely unadorned. No qualifications. No context offered in mitigation. Just the 2 words said directly to her face in front of every operator and every senior person who had been in the room that morning. Claire held his gaze for a moment. "I accept it," she said, "and I want to be clear about something." She looked around the room, not just at Holloway, but at the men who had laughed. At Reyes, who had pressed his lips together to keep from smiling. At the operators who had exchanged amused glances. What happened this morning wasn't just about me. If I had actually been what you all assumed I was, a visitor who had entered the wrong room, she would have experienced exactly what you showed her. And she would have left and taken whatever she knew with her, and you would have been poorer for it and never known it. The room was very quiet. "That is not a hypothetical," Claire said. "That happens every day in organizations like this one. People who belong in rooms get told they don't, and they leave, and the room loses something it can't measure because it never knew it was there. I am not asking you to feel guilty about this morning. I am asking you to remember it." Reyes in the back of the room was no longer the young operator who had found the joke funny at 5:40 in the morning. He was someone who had spent the last 5 hours watching the woman. They laughed at rebuild a broken mission, catch a traitor, locate a missing hostage, and bring everyone home with 15 seconds of margin. And now she was standing at the front of the room, not taking a victory lap, but giving them something they could use. He was 29 years old and he understood, sitting in that chair, that he had just learned something he was going to carry for a very long time. Debrief is closed, Claire said. Get some rest. Full written reports by 0800 tomorrow. The room began to move. People stood and gathered their materials and began filtering toward the door with the quiet efficiency of people who had been awake since before dawn and were running on reserves and knew that what they needed now was food and sleep and the particular kind of silence that comes after high-intensity work. Holloway stood and was one of the last to move toward the door. He stopped beside Claire on his way out. Up close, the exhaustion on him was more visible than it had been on the tarmac. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from carrying enormous responsibility through an enormous amount of pressure and still having to process the human weight of what Trevor Kane had done, of what that betrayal meant, of the conversation that was still waiting for him somewhere down the road, the formal investigation, the questions about what he had missed, the examination of a 4-year professional relationship that had turned out to be built partly on a foundation he hadn't seen. That was going to be its own kind of hard. The Kane thing, Holloway said, not a question, more like a man trying to find the beginning of a sentence he wasn't sure how to finish. The investigation will take time, Claire said, but the picture is clear enough. He was recruited through financial vulnerability. He believed for a while that the information he was selling was low consequence. By the time he understood otherwise, he was too compromised to walk away cleanly. How do you miss that? Holloway said. 4 years. I worked with him for 4 years. You didn't miss it, Claire said. He hid it. Those are different things. Holloway looked at her. You're being generous, he said. I'm being accurate, she said. Counterintelligence failures are almost never about the person who missed the signs. They're about the person who was working very hard to make sure the signs were missable. Kane was good at his job. He was good enough at it that he knew exactly how to stay below the threshold of suspicion for people who trusted him. Holloway was quiet for a moment. He told us about the basement, he said. Yes, that matters. It does, Claire said. It won't change the legal outcome, but it matters. Holloway nodded slowly. He started toward the door again. Then he stopped one more time, and when he turned back, there was something in his expression that was different from anything she had seen on him in all morning. Not the commanding authority, not the controlled anger, not the professional focus of a man running a mission. Something younger than all of that, something that looked like a person who had just spent a day looking at themselves clearly and didn't entirely like what they saw. The thing you said, he started, about respect that depends on someone's resume not being real respect. Claire waited. You're right, he said. I've known that. I've known it for years. I've told younger operators the same thing. A short pause. Knowing something and living it are different. Yes, Claire said, they are. I'll live it better, he said. Not a promise made for her benefit, not performance. Just a man making a commitment to himself in the only honest way. Such commitments can be made out loud to a specific person about a specific failure. Claire looked at him for a moment. I know you will, she said, and she meant it. He nodded and he left. The room was empty, except for Claire and Beckett, who had stayed behind in the particular way Beckett always stayed behind, present, without imposing, available, without demanding. He began stacking chairs in the corner of the room with the quiet helpfulness of a man who treats physical tasks as a form of consideration. Claire sat down at the table and opened her debrief notes and began typing the after-action summary that would go to Whitmore by end of day. You were hard on yourself in the debrief, Beckett said. Not a criticism, an observation. I was accurate, Claire said, without looking up. 11 minutes on the secondary signature, Beckett said. Given everything else you were managing simultaneously. 11 minutes, Claire said again. A person was in a basement. 11 minutes matters. Beckett set down the chair he was holding and looked at her across the room. You know, he said, in 23 years, I have sat through a lot of debriefs. I have watched a lot of leaders do a lot of different things with the space at the front of a room. Claire kept typing. The ones who got it right, Beckett said, were always the ones who were harder on themselves than anyone else in the room would have been. Claire stopped typing. She looked up at him. Beckett picked up another chair and stacked it. Just an observation, he said. Claire held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to typing. Master Chief, she said without looking up. Major, thank you for checking the raw sensor data this morning. When I identified the interference pattern, you didn't wait for Holloway's confirmation. You just checked. Beckett was quiet for a moment. You were right, he said simply. When someone is right, you check. A lot of people in that room waited to see what Commander Holloway thought before they decided whether I was worth listening to, Claire said. Yes, Beckett said. They did. You didn't. Beckett set down the last chair and straightened up. I've been doing this long enough, he said, to know that the person who walks into a room quietly and sits down without explanation is usually the most interesting person in the room. A beat, or the most dangerous one. Claire smiled. It was a small smile, the first one of the day. Beckett saw it. He picked up his materials and moved toward the door. Get some sleep, Major, he said. You've earned it. After the report, Claire said. Of course, Beckett said, and left. The room was empty. Claire typed for 40 minutes. The after-action report was thorough and honest and covered everything. The intelligence failure, the security breach, the mission adaptations, the outcome. She wrote Kane's role with precision and without cruelty. She wrote Holloway's leadership of his element with the same honest assessment she applied to everything where it worked, where it could have been stronger, what the modified plan demanded of him, and how he delivered. She wrote Garza's performance in terms that she knew would follow him the rest of his career in the best possible way, because what he had done in that maintenance building basement with 3 people and imperfect information deserved to be documented clearly. She wrote about the 15-second margin. She wrote mission success was achieved with 15 seconds of margin on the extraction timeline. This is unacceptable as a planning standard. The adaptive responses during execution compress that margin from what should have been a 60-second buffer. Future mission architectures in this domain must build additional redundancy into extraction timing to account for intelligence picture degradation during active operations. The 15-second outcome was not a demonstration of effective planning under pressure. It was a demonstration of effective recovery from insufficient initial planning. Those are not the same thing. She sent it to Whitmore at 12:51 in the afternoon. His reply came 4 minutes later. It said, "Outstanding work, Major. Come see me tomorrow morning. We need to talk about your next assignment." Claire read it once, set down the tablet, and sat for a moment in the empty operations room where 7 hours earlier a man had grabbed her folder off a table and dropped it on the floor outside the door and told her this briefing wasn't for visitors. She thought about the 5 people who were in the medical wing right now. She thought about the 15 seconds. She thought about Holloway standing at the tarmac extending his hand and Garza saying her name over the net and Beckett checking the raw sensor data without waiting for anyone's permission. She thought about Kane sitting in the corner of the room with his face in his hands. There were no clean victories. There never were. There was always something that deserved a harder look, a better decision, a faster response. That was not pessimism. That was the discipline that made the next mission survivable. She closed the tablet. She stood up. She picked up her plain, dark field jacket and her secure tablet and her folder, and she walked out of the operations room into a hallway that smelled like institutional coffee and fluorescent light and all the familiar rhythms of a facility that never fully slept. And behind her, the tactical display still showed the terrain map of the Nevada desert and the corrected intelligence picture and the extraction route that had worked by 15 seconds in the position of a maintenance building 460 meters from a compound where 5 Americans had been held. All 5 home, all 15 seconds counted. 3 weeks passed. The Nevada facility moved the way it always moved, with the controlled, purposeful rhythm of a place that measured time in mission cycles rather than calendar days. New personnel rotated in. Equipment was serviced and recertified. The operations room that had held the most intense 6 hours of the year was cleaned, reset, and used for 3 other briefings before the week was out, because that was the nature of the work. The room did not care what had happened in it. The people did. The 5 hostages were transferred to a military medical facility within 48 hours of recovery. All 5 were expected to make full physical recoveries. The youngest of them, a 26-year-old logistics coordinator named Marcus Webb, who had been on his first international humanitarian deployment, sent a handwritten note to the Nevada facility that arrived 11 days after the mission. It was addressed simply to the team. Nobody was named. But the note said that he had been told there was a moment during the operation when the people responsible for bringing him home had 15 seconds to spare, and that he thought about those 15 seconds every morning when he woke up, and that he wanted whoever made those 15 seconds happened to know that he understood exactly what they were worth. Claire read the note once. She folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her field jacket. She didn't show it to anyone. The Kane investigation moved through channels with the particular combination of speed and deliberateness that classified security cases demanded. The counterintelligence team that took over from the facility's internal security process within 48 hours of the mission was thorough and methodical. And the picture they assembled over the following 3 weeks was more complete than anything Claire had seen in the relay logs. The full timeline of Kane's recruitment, the specific intelligence he had passed the foreign intermediary who had approached him through a financial services connection in a city that Claire was not cleared to be named in the written record. What the investigation confirmed was what Kane had said in the corner of the operations room with his face eventually in his hands. It had started small, a conversation, a payment that felt manageable against a debt that felt impossible. Then another conversation, then another payment, the specific mechanism by which a capable, respected officer had been walked step by step from professional integrity into active betrayal of his own people, not through ideology, not through grievance, but through the oldest and most mundane of human vulnerabilities. Money and the shame of needing it in the particular trap of a first compromise that makes every subsequent one feel inevitable by comparison. Holloway read the investigation summary when it was cleared for his level. He read it twice. Then he closed the file and sat with it for a long time in the kind of silence that a man sits in when he is doing the work of accepting something that cannot be unchanged. He had known Kane for 4 years. He had trusted him with intelligence that put his operators' lives at risk. And the investigation confirmed something that Claire had told him the night of the mission in the empty debrief room when he had asked how you missed something like that for 4 years. She had said you didn't miss it. He hid it. Those are different things. Holloway had held those words carefully in the weeks since. Not as absolution, he was constitutionally incapable of using someone else's words as absolution for something he felt he should examine more carefully, but as a frame, a way of understanding what had happened that was accurate rather than simply punishing. Because the alternative, the version where he blamed himself for 4 years of missed signals in a man who had been specifically and professionally trained to generate no signals led nowhere useful. And Holloway was above everything else a man oriented toward what was useful. I was thinking about this on the morning of the joint exercise briefing 3 weeks after Silent Lantern when he walked into the operations room and saw Claire at the front of the space setting up the primary display with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to every room she entered. He stopped in the doorway. She was wearing the same plain dark field jacket, carrying the same secure tablet. The sealed folder was on the table beside her. She was moving through the display setup with focused attention, and she hadn't heard him yet. And for just a moment, he watched her and thought about the first time he had seen her stand in this room and what he had done and who he had been in that moment. Then he walked in. "Morning," he said. She looked up. "Morning, Commander. How are the slides looking?" "They'll be ready." She glanced at him with the brief assessing look. She gave almost everything quick, comprehensive filing the result. "How are you?" The question surprised him slightly. Not because it was inappropriate, because she asked it directly without the social padding that most people wrap such questions in, and it landed as a genuine inquiry rather than a conversational formality. "Getting there," he said. She nodded, returned to the display. "The investigation summary," he said. He hadn't planned to bring it up, but it was there between them in the way that significant shared experiences sit in the space between people who went through them together. "I read it," Claire said. "The part about the initial recruitment," Holloway said. "The financial vulnerability, the first payment." "Yes. We don't have anything in our standard personnel review process that would reliably catch that," Holloway said. "Not at the level of subtlety Kane was operating at. We have financial disclosure requirements, but they're point-in-time snapshots. Someone managing a debt crisis between disclosure windows disappears into the gap," Claire said. "Yes. I know," she said. I've been working on a recommendation for Whitmore about continuous financial monitoring for personnel in sensitive access positions. Not invasive, threshold-based, the kind of system that flags anomalies rather than surveilling routine. It won't catch everything, but it would have caught Kane 18 months earlier than we caught him. Holloway looked at her. You were already working on it, he said. I started the draft the day after the mission, Claire said. He absorbed that. The way she did it, not waiting for an assignment, not waiting for someone to identify the gap and task her with filling it. Just seeing what needed to exist and building it. Can I read the draft, he said. She looked up at him again. This time the assessment held a fraction longer. I'll send it to you this afternoon, she said. He nodded. New operators were beginning to filter into the room. A joint exercise group personnel from multiple branches who had been assigned to the Nevada facility for a 2-week cross-training rotation. They came in the way new personnel always came into unfamiliar spaces, reading the room, identifying the hierarchy, calibrating their behavior to what they observed. Holloway watched them find seats and recognized in their body language the same process he had run through 100 times in his career. New room, new people. Who matters here and how much and what do they know? A young operator, couldn't have been more than 26, took a seat near the back and looked toward the front of the room where Claire was finalizing the display setup. He leaned toward the operator beside him and said something quietly. The other operator shrugged. The young operator caught Holloway's eye. Holloway had been standing near the door, and the young operator clearly recognized his rank insignia and calculated accordingly. Commander, what the young operator said with the polite directness of someone who had decided the fastest way to get information was to ask the most senior person available. Can I ask who's running the brief this morning? Holloway looked across the room at Claire. He looked back at the young operator. And in the space of that single second, he felt the full weight of 3 weeks sitting in the moment. The mission, the debrief, the tarmac, the empty room, and the 2 words, I'm sorry, and her response that was neither warm nor cold, but exactly precise. He felt the weight of a joke he had made at 5:40 in the morning that he would spend a long time not forgetting. He felt what it cost to be the person he had been that morning. And he felt what it meant to have the choice right now to be someone different. Major Claire Donovan, he said. His voice was clear and unhesitating. She runs the operation. The young operator nodded and looked toward Claire with the immediate recalibration of someone who had received the information they needed. And then something happened that Holloway had not expected and that hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. The operator beside the young one, a staff sergeant who had clearly been at the facility longer, leaned over and said quietly but audibly, "You don't know who she is." The young operator shook his head. The staff sergeant said, "Silent Lantern, 3 weeks ago, 5 hostages, compromised intelligence, active internal leak. She rebuilt the whole mission picture in under 2 hours and brought everyone home." The young operator went still. He looked at Claire again, different eyes this time. Holloway watched it happen and felt something move through him that he struggled to identify for a moment before he named it. It wasn't pride exactly. It wasn't vicarious satisfaction. It was something more specific than that, the particular feeling of watching the world correct itself in real time. Of watching the moment when someone's actual record travels faster than assumptions can outrun it. The room filled. 15 operators, 4 senior NCOs, 2 intelligence officers, a communications specialist, and 1 Navy liaison officer who had driven 3 hours from his home station to attend the cross-training rotation and looked like he regretted not getting more sleep the night before. Claire called the briefing to order at 0800 exactly. She was 2 minutes into the joint exercise overview when the Navy liaison officer raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "before we get into the exercise structure, I want to confirm the command authority for this rotation. My orders show a joint mission coordinator position, but the name attached is," he paused, consulting his paperwork, "Major Donovan, Air Force. I want to make sure I have the right room." The room went very still. Not the way it had gone still 3 weeks ago. Not with the particular quality of men deciding whether to laugh. It went still the way rooms go still when people sense that something is about to become a moment. Holloway was sitting at the table this time, not standing over her, sitting at the table like every other senior person in the room. He waited. He wanted to see what she would do. Claire looked at the Navy liaison officer with the same steady, unhurried attention she gave everything. You have the right room, she said. Major Claire Donovan, Air Force, Joint Mission Coordinator for this rotation by General Whitmore's designation. If you need to verify the chain of command documentation, I can have it to you before close of business today. If you don't need to verify it, I'd like to continue so we can finish the overview before the first exercise block. The liaison officer looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he nodded and put his paperwork down. Please continue, ma'am, he said. She continued. Holloway watched the room watch her. He watched the young operator in the back track her presentation with focused attention. He watched the staff sergeant who had explained Silent Lantern sit with the particular contained energy of someone who already knew the quality of what they were listening to. He watched the intelligence officers take notes. He watched the liaison officer who had started the morning with a territorial question progressively lose his defensiveness over the course of 20 minutes as Claire moved through the exercise framework with a clarity and operational depth that made the source of her authority self-evident. Competence was its own argument. It always had been. The difference was whether the room was willing to hear it before someone with stars on their collar confirmed it. Midway through the briefing, Claire reached the intelligence integration section and began walking through the cross-domain coordination requirements for the exercise. It was complex material, the kind of multi-layered coordination framework that required participants to hold multiple streams of information simultaneously and understand how they interacted. She presented it without notes, moving through it with the fluency of someone who had built it from first principles and understood not just what each element required, but why. The Navy liaison officer raised his hand again. Holloway braced. Ma'am, the liaison officer said, the passive surveillance integration you're describing is that based on the Silent Lantern architecture, a beat of silence. Modified from it, Claire said. The Silent Lantern operation identified several gaps in how we were integrating passive surveillance feeds with active intelligence streams in real time. This exercise is designed partly to test a revised integration protocol that addresses those gaps. The liaison officer nodded slowly. I read the after-action summary, he said, the 15-second margin on the extraction. Yes, Claire said. Your report said it was unacceptable as a planning standard. It was. And this exercise is designed to widen that margin. Significantly, Claire said, the goal is a minimum 60-second buffer under degraded intelligence conditions. If we can't reliably build 60 seconds of margin into an extraction timeline, even when the picture is compromised, we need to find out why in a training environment rather than an operational one. The liaison officer looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I think I understand now why General Whitmore designated this position the way he did. It was as close as a senior military officer of that generation came to saying out loud that he had underestimated someone and was revising his assessment. Claire received it without ceremony. Let's keep moving, she said. We have a lot of ground to cover. The briefing ran 90 minutes. When it ended, the room moved with the focused energy of people who had just received a large volume of precise information and were now processing it against the work they needed to do. Small conversations started at the edges of the space. Questions got asked and answered. The Navy liaison officer approached Claire directly with 3 specific questions about the intelligence integration protocol that were detailed and technical and showed he had been listening carefully throughout. Holloway stood near the door and watched the room and thought about a morning 3 weeks ago when he had stood in the same space and pointed toward the same door and said words he wished he could take back. Beckett appeared beside him. The two of them stood there for a moment watching Claire answer the liaison officer's questions with the patient precision she brought to everything. She sent me the financial monitoring draft, Beckett said quietly. Holloway looked at him. She sent it to you. She sent it to everyone who was in the room that morning, Beckett said. Whitmore, you meet Garza, the Army element leader. She wanted input from operational perspectives before she finalized it for formal submission. Holloway absorbed that. She's building consensus, he said. She's being smart, Beckett said. There's a difference between having authority and building the kind of trust that makes authority actually function. She knows the difference. Holloway nodded slowly. What did you think of the draft? He said. I told her the threshold triggers need to be calibrated differently for forward deployed personnel versus facility-based assignments. Beckett said. Financial pressure patterns look different depending on operational tempo. She's incorporating it into the revision. She listens, Holloway said. Yes, Beckett said. She does. They were quiet for a moment. Grant, Beckett said. He used the first name the way he always did, rarely and therefore meaningfully. You did the right thing this morning with the young operator. Holloway said nothing. Major Donovan, she runs the operation, Beckett said with the faint quality of a man quoting something back to the person who said it. Simple, clear, no performance, just the truth. It was the truth, Holloway said. I know, Beckett said. That's why it was the right thing. He moved away into the room to catch Garza, who had just arrived from the adjacent building and was looking for the coffee that had been promised at the start of the rotation. Holloway stayed near the door. The Navy liaison officer finished his questions and thanked Claire and moved toward the door, nodding to Holloway as he passed with the collegial acknowledgement of a man who had recalibrated and wasn't uncomfortable about it. The room thinned. Claire began breaking down the display setup. Holloway walked over. Good brief, he said. She didn't look up from the equipment. Thank you. The liaison officer, Holloway said. He came in sideways. A little, Claire said. She was coiling a cable with the neat practice efficiency of someone who had set up and broken down 100 briefing rooms. You handled it cleanly, Holloway said. She looked at him. It wasn't difficult to handle. He asked a legitimate question about command authority. I answered it. He listened. That's how it's supposed to work. That's not always how it works, Holloway said. No, she agreed. It's not. Holloway picked up the far end of the display cabling and began coiling his side. It was an automatic gesture, a man who had spent 20 years in operational environments where you helped break down the room, because that was what you did. And Claire looked at it briefly without comment, and they worked the equipment in a shared silence that was entirely different from the charged hostile silence of 3 weeks ago. Whitmore said you're taking a new assignment, Holloway said. In 6 weeks, Claire said, Joint Special Operations Planning Directorate at the Pentagon, building the cross-domain intelligence integration program at the institutional level. Taking the Silent Lantern architecture to scale, Holloway said. Taking the lessons from Silent Lantern to scale, she said. The architecture still needs work. That's the point. Holloway set down the coiled cable. Washington will be different from Nevada, he said. More politics. More people who decide whether to listen based on who you are before they hear what you say. Claire looked at him with the steady, level gaze he had come to understand was simply how she looked at things fully, without flinching, without editorial. It was like that here too, she said, for the first 40 minutes. He felt that land. Yes, he said, it was. I'll manage, she said. I know you will, he said. And he meant it the way he had meant very few things in his professional career, with the complete conviction of a man who had watched someone perform under conditions specifically designed to reveal everything and had seen exactly who they were and had no remaining uncertainty about it whatsoever. He picked up his materials and moved toward the door. Then something made him stop. It was the same doorway he had stood in that morning 3 weeks ago. The same angle, the same light, the same operational room behind him. The geometry of it pulled at something in his memory, and he turned back one more time. Claire was finishing the equipment breakdown, moving with the same unhurried efficiency she had brought to everything from the moment she walked in with her tablet and her folder and sat in the chair that nobody had told her she could sit in. I thought about what she had said to him in the debrief room on the night of the mission. The answer to his question about why she hadn't announced her authority when he called her sweetheart and told her the door was that way. Because I wanted to know how you treated someone you thought couldn't do anything for you. He had carried those words for 3 weeks. Turned them over, examined them from every angle, not as a verdict on who he was. He had too much experience with the way people grew and changed to accept any single moment as a permanent definition, but as a standard. A question worth asking about himself regularly in rooms he hadn't been in before and with people he hadn't assessed yet. How do I treat someone I think can't do anything for me? It was the most important question in any leadership environment. It was the question he had failed on the morning of October 14th in this room at 5:40 in the morning. It was the question he intended to answer differently for the rest of his career. Major, he said. She looked up. When you're in Washington, he said, if you build something that needs an operational testing ground, a real one, not an exercise environment. She waited. Call Nevada, he said. Call me. Claire looked at him for a moment, and then for only the second time since the morning she walked through that door, she smiled. Not the small, private smile she had given Beckett in the empty room. Something wider than that, something that acknowledged without sentimentality and without performance that a significant distance had been traveled between the two of them and that the destination was worth the journey. "I will," she said. He nodded and left. The hallway was quiet outside the operations room. The facility moved around him with its usual purposeful rhythm, people walking with intent conversations that got to the point quickly, the particular institutional efficiency of a place where time was measured in mission-critical intervals rather than casual hours. Holloway walked toward the tarmac. He needed air, and he needed to think, and those two things had always worked best for him in the same place. He walked to the edge of the tarmac where 3 weeks ago he had stood beside Whitmore and watched the helicopters land and walked toward Claire and extended his hand. He stood there now and looked out at the desert that began where the facility's perimeter ended and stretched in every direction farther than the eye could resolve. I thought about the morning he had grabbed her folder and dropped it on the floor. I thought about the moment Beckett's face had changed over the raw sensor data. He thought about 5 Americans being loaded into vehicles and a woman at a tactical display, rebuilding a broken mission picture in under 2 hours and 15 seconds of margin on an extraction timeline. He thought about a young operator asking who's she and what it had meant to answer that question the right way. I thought about what Aaron Beckett had said. "You did the right thing this morning," and how strange it was that the right thing had been so simple. Just a name. Just the truth. Major Claire Donovan. She runs the operation. No General Whitmore in the room to provide it. No formal announcement required. Just a man who had learned something, saying what he knew. 6 weeks later, Claire Donovan left Nevada for Washington. She left the way she had arrived, without ceremony, without entourage, without anyone being asked to make a moment of it. She signed out at the security desk at 6:40 in the morning with a single bag over her shoulder and her tablet under her arm and her plain dark field jacket, and she walked to the waiting vehicle with the same unhurried, purposeful stride she brought to every room she had ever entered. Beckett was at the security desk when she signed out. He was not there by accident. "Safe travels, Major," he said. "Thank you, Master Chief," she said. "Pentagon won't know what hit them," he said. Claire looked at him with those steady eyes. "Let's hope not," she said, and meant it practically. She got in the vehicle. Beckett watched it pull away from the facility, and he stood there for a moment in the quiet of early morning, and he thought about a room full of experienced, decorated operators who had laughed at a woman for sitting in the wrong chair, and about the 5 people who came home because she was sitting in exactly the right chair. Then he went back to work, because that was what she would have done. 3 months after Claire arrived at the Pentagon, the cross-domain intelligence integration program she had been tasked to build was presented to a joint oversight committee for the first time. It was a comprehensive framework drawing from the lessons of Silent Lantern, from the financial monitoring recommendations that had incorporated Beckett's operational feedback and Holloway's counterintelligence insights, from 11 other missions across 3 commands that Claire had requested access to analyze in her first 30 days. It was the kind of work that made people in rooms with serious authority sit up straight and ask the kind of questions that led to resources being allocated and programs being funded. One of the committee members, a retired 4-star, who now served in an advisory capacity, asked Claire after the formal presentation how long she had been working on the framework. "The formal version, 30 days, Claire said. "The informal version, about 11 years. He looked at her over his reading glasses. "You've been building this for 11 years without a program to build it in," he said. "I've been building the understanding that makes the program possible," Claire said. "The program needed a reason to exist. Silent Lantern was that reason." He studied her for a moment. "General Whitmore speaks very highly of you," he said. "General Whitmore is generous," Claire said. "He said something specific," the retired 4-star said. "He said you walked into a room where nobody believed you belonged, and you proceeded to save every person in it." Claire held his gaze. "I did my job," she said. "The people in that room did theirs. The outcome belonged to all of them." The retired 4-star looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting next week. Bring the full technical specifications." "I'll be there," Claire said. Back in Nevada on the morning that Claire's program received its initial funding approval, word traveled fast in certain channels. Holloway was running his team through a pre-mission brief for a training exercise when one of the newer operators, a young petty officer who had arrived at the facility 6 weeks earlier, looked up from the modified intelligence integration protocol they were reviewing and said, "Commander, this framework, this cross-domain integration structure, this is based on something real, isn't it?" It wasn't entirely a question. Holloway looked at the framework on the screen. He thought about a woman with a tablet in a sealed folder sitting in a chair that nobody had told her she could sit in, and about the most important question in any leadership environment, and about what it meant to answer it differently than you had before. "Yes," he said, "it's based on something real." "What operation?" the young petty officer asked. Holloway looked at him. "Silent Lantern," he said. "Look it up after the brief. The after-action report is cleared to your level now." Then he returned to the exercise. And in Washington, 3 time zones away, Major Claire Donovan walked into another room full of people who didn't know her, yet set her tablet on the table, opened her folder, and sat down. She did not announce herself. She did not explain her authority. She simply began to work. Because the mission was always the mission, the room was always the room, and the work, the quiet, disciplined, mission-first work of someone who understood that real authority was never announced, but always demonstrated that work spoke for itself. It always had, it always would.